Well, tonight we're going to talk about retirement. We're going to talk about some of the issues, some of the products that you save for and that you can use to save and build, build a nest egg and invest. Right now, though, it's a pretty challenging time. There's a lot of things going on that are going to change in that are changing, have changed. Right now, the stock market's cranking. It's doing quite well, but obviously that people always think it's a bubble. Could be, there's been some bubbles before, but I don't see that happening. And the scary thing with bubbles is that you don't want to get out early, because just before the bubble pops is when all the gains are made. So if there is indeed a bubble, getting out early isn't necessarily the best call. Staying in too late is absolutely the worst, but anyway, most people don't have the time to do that. One solution to that is dollar cost averaging. And dollar cost averaging, it applies to everything in terms of investing. And if you've got a regular investment program set up where you're taking money every month from your income and investing, you're essentially dollar cost averaging. And so what that means in practical terms is if the market does go down or, whatever, and you're investing a fixed dollar amount, say, $200, $500 a month, whatever it is. In good times, when the market's up, well, you're not really selling, you're buying. So that's, you're buying the shares at their highest price, but because you've got a fixed amount, the $200 or $500, you're only buying that much. You're not making larger swings. And since you're consistently doing that same amount, when the stock market is low, then you're buying more shares. So it all kind of averages out. Market timing is a great thing, but the best of them have, tried and failed to figure that out. And, the whole buy the dip and some of those things, even crypto is now, it's losing its predictability, so it makes it very hard. Another thing is diversification. If you have concentrated investments all in one sector, all in one thing, say you're all in the tech sector or all in crypto, it can be very good, but it's also pretty dangerous, because if bad things happen, you're going to get clobbered. And you can do this across other things. You could keep all of your stock investments maybe in high tech or the Magnificent Seven that you hear talked about. But you may also have some money in real estate and other things, or dare I say bonds. Not a big fan, but anyway, bonds would provide a hedge. It's not all in the same thing. So if the market does get clobbered, obviously it's going to come back. And especially now, the government tends to interact. It's kind of sad that it almost encourages irresponsible behavior, because people get bailed out if they screw up. That's what happened kind of with the big boys back in 2007, whatever. Not a lot of people, if anybody, went to jail, and they all, were kind of bailed out by the other people. Decentralization of financial industry and new products. You have to keep be a little bit aware of what's going on, because things are changing. And that relates to this third bullet about the challenging job market and political environment. Artificial intelligence. If you're doing something that, well, first off, there may be a model in the future where not quite as many people go to college, because the trades are kind of where a lot of those jobs are. But even that being said, a lot of the jobs, the AI can replicate them, or they can get one really intelligent person and kind of harness his or her skills and have them, control more products through artificial intelligence. And then the last thing is kind of the wealth inequality. We're seeing this in New York. I mean, cities come and go. I think New York is kind of I think they're kind of done, to tell you the truth. The problem is that post COVID, there was a lot of technology that was put in place during COVID, Zoom and other stuff, remote work. Then you introduce AI, and then you have the tax situation that's emerging. And so there's plenty other places out there, Austin, Miami, whatever, and those two obviously no state income tax. So if you're paying some highly compensated employee, you're paying them a few $100,000. That's good money, I guess, in New York, but it's great money in Florida, and you can attract. It's going to cost the company the same. Actually, it's going to cost them less in a place like Florida. Lower regulation, lower cost for office space if they have to even have an office, and then the amount of money that the employee gets to keep makes New York just unattractive. The problem that happens now is that if you raise taxes like they're proposing to do, especially a targeted wealth tax, those people are going to leave. And so, fair enough. That's they have agency, they have their own prerogative, but that means that elections going the same direction are pretty much inevitable. When you have a certain number of people pulling the cart and a certain number of people riding in the cart, and the people who are pulling the cart say, nope, we're done, we're out, it just puts more people, the higher percentage, in the cart. So I don't know how drastic the changes are going to be, but there's a lot of things that might be able to be done on a federal level where they can go into debt doing it. But on a local level, municipalities, they can say they want child care for this or government run grocery stores, but the problem is, where are you going to get the money? And the fact is, New York wasn't in great financial shape because of some of these other reasons, and their income is actually going to be going down. It all gets back to the Laffer curve and some other things where if you raise taxes, you can raise the percentage of taxes, but the actual receipts to the government actually go down. It's, I can show you examples of where lowering taxes actually results in higher amount of taxes going to the government. But anyway, that's getting more into politics. But anyway, it's things like this happen. Detroit was Detroit, I think it was the top 4 city back in the 50s in terms of population. Now it's number 20. And population-wise, they lost 61, a little over 61% of their population just said, yep, we're gone. And, so we'll see what happens. But, I don't think the quality of life and all that stuff, once you take all that wealth out of there, if people do indeed leave, it's not going to go well. So retirement planning. Okay, so first thing, if you look at your term paper, Social Security is part of it, right? You need to go to the government website, the Social Security website, figure out how many quarters you got, and you can look at some models and how many actual, how much your Social Security would actually be, when you hit age 62. Now, 62, that's the earliest you can retire right now, and because this program is pretty much insolvent already, they're probably going to up that age. So anyway, right now you can take it at its earliest point at age 62, and the normal age where you get the maximum benefit is age 67. So you might get an extra $1,000. So let's say you get $2,000 a month if you retire at age 62, and you get $3,000 a month if you retire at age 67. Now you may say, well, that's why would I not wait? Well, because number one, things can happen. You're not going to have that money in between, so that's one thing. And then anyway, when you get to that point, most of you got 30, 40 years to worry about that, and the program will probably actually change by then. So cross that bridge when you get to it. But whatever. I'm one of those people who would take it day one. I can do better with my money, and invest it, and but anyway, it's up to you. But the point is that this isn't a tremendous amount of money. Sure, you can probably get by on that amount of money, but it's not going to be a, if you didn't buy a house, or if you're living in some place with high property taxes, you're not going to make it. You're going to have to give up the house, or you're going to have to downsize. You're going to have to do something. If your total income is 24 or 36,000 in today's dollars, it's not going to be the lavish retirement you're looking for, and you may have more medical expenses. Medicare comes in at 65, but again, it's not perfect either. Qualifying, you need 40 credits, so they do that by quarters. So 4 credits per year. Also available for disabled, which is a good thing, but it also does, you can start collecting Social Security quite young if you're disabled. But should that be funded by Social Security, or should that come out of maybe a general government fund, because Social Security's going bankrupt? So some of the disability costs that get lumped onto Social Security for people at a working age is maybe an error that politicians will have to address. Survivor benefits, yep, children and other things. There's other parts of the program. So the intent was, it was supposed to be sort of a lockbox, You were supposed to contribute money to it. The government's holding on to it for you, and then you're going to get it back when you're in retirement. Yeah, didn't quite happen that way. It's, in essence, a Ponzi scheme. You pay money in today if you're working right now, and that money's given out to current retirees. And if you had a baby boom generation, if people were having more children, maybe you could hold up that sort of situation. But now you've got a huge baby boomer, hence the name, baby boomer population that's taken a lot of money out, and a smaller amount of people working, or doing gig work, or just not working, doing other things. So it's put it under some pressure. Depends on your income. About 40% of your annual income is what they're saying. So they're expecting you to have some savings. If you're living on it solely, it's going to be rough. So you get reduced benefits beginning at 62, and then typically 67. Limited income while receiving Social Security. So if you're making money, and you exceed about $20-some thousand a year, roughly, they start deducting that from your Social Security. So, but that's W-2 income. If you're making money on investments, if you're doing other stuff with your money, it doesn't affect your Social Security. And Social Security is income too, so it is taxable. Trump was actually talking about changing that, but right now, no, it's taxable income. Retirees living longer, yep. Number of retirees continues to grow. At some point, that'll, slacken, but right now, yeah, you've got this worst case scenario with a whole bunch of retirees and not as many people paying in. Many people are relying less on Social Security. Yeah, pretty soon, just how bad of shape this thing is in, they're probably going to do what they call means testing, meaning that if you are, somebody with a lot of assets or other income, they'll probably take your Social Security away, which you may think is all right, but in actuality, you took these people's money, the government did, with an agreement that it was being set aside for them, and now they're sort of saying, the rules have changed. Anyway, they're going to do what they're going to do. And like I say, when the voting block, when you've got more people taking benefits than paying in, there's no, Margaret Thatcher, not a popular politician, prime minister in the UK, but some people love her. Anyway, she did have a very famous quote about socialism. She said, in essence, I'm butchering it here a little bit, but socialism is great until you run out of other people's money, and that's it. I mean, you see a lot of countries in Europe that have tried extensive social programs, but they've ratcheted back. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Norway and some of the other places in Scandinavia, and they're not quite as socialist. They're not the socialist success stories. They kind of ratcheted back on a lot of those programs, and the ones that still have them, even Germany and the UK, their finances are France. Just they're you know, in a death spiral on a national level rather than just a city. Where you go to get the information, so Social Security, yep. And there's a calculator on there, basically, you know, will tell you what you can look forward to. And again, if that is your sole source of income, not going to be happy. Now, you know, yeah, you may have had some medical issues, you may have something happen, you wiped out your savings, or you didn't work. I mean, the other thing is too, because of the nature of the program, it was supposed to be, you know, a sort of a government retirement program, but you were paying in with your number of quarters. If you didn't work, then yeah, you don't have any Social Security coming to you. Employee-sponsored retirement plans. Employees and employers contribute. Penalties imposed for early withdrawal. Contributions are tax deferred but treated as ordinary income when withdrawn after retirement. So, there were these big, you know, traditional retirements. Like, say you went to work way back for, you know, some big corporation, and you got a retirement, and you didn't even pay into it necessarily. You just worked there 30, 40 years, and those programs are basically gone. Now, it's sort of a sharing concept where you have things called 401ks or 403bs or IRAs or SEPs or all sorts of, different programs that are sort of a combination of the employee and the employer. And so the employer, typically good companies will have some sort of match where you put up, you know, 2% of your into your 401k, and they go ahead and add 3%, you know, and so you end up with building a nest egg that way. Also, one of the features of this is that it's tax deferred. So let's say you're making $100,000 a year, and you're pretty aggressively investing in your 401k. If you want to get up to the max, you know, up around 20,000, because the limits change based upon your filing status, also based upon income and the rest of it. But anyway, let's say if you're putting about 20,000 in there, when you go to file your taxes at the end of the year, you're only paying taxes on $80,000. That 20,000 that you put in the 401k is tax deferred. Now, it's not tax exempt, it's not tax free. It will be taxed when you withdraw it later in life. And that early withdrawal is before age 59 and a half. So if you stay till age 59 and a half, you know, without taking any money out of that, you're, you know, a distribution, you're going to keep it in the tax deferred status. Now, when you pull it out, say you pull out $20,000, that will be reflected as $20,000 of income. So again, you'll get taxed on it eventually, but the theory is that if you take it out to retirement, let's say you're age 65 or whatever, you quit your job, and now you're going to start drawing on your 401k, your earned income should be essentially, if you're truly retired, will be zero. So your only income will be that 20,000 or whatever you decide to take from your 401k. So that's how it works. There's other things. There's hardships, medical issues, and there's even some things like money for a first-time home buyer that you could actually get access to this money. So you have to look at the IRS regs, the IRS instructions on that. But there are ways to get at the money, and additionally, you can take loans against it. They don't talk much about loans, but I've taken so many loans against my 401ks. I mean, it's the best loan ever because the interest rates are quite low, and you're paying the interest to yourself, and you don't have to do any qualification, any filling out of an application, any of that. You just take a loan against it, and it comes out of your check. And the only problem with that is if you quit, you got to pay it all back when you're terminated or your final day or whatever. When you move on, if you took out a loan for 20 grand, you got to come up with that 20 grand, and they'll just deduct that from your 401k, but they'll also impose a penalty if you don't have it in there, if it's loaned out. So defined benefit plan. So this is what I was talking about, the old school plans. Now vesting can be in both types of plans. So that was a employee sponsored one, and then here's this defined benefit. This is the old school type. Now vesting, let's say there was a match, and you get, you invest 2% and the employer invests 3%. Well, if you quit after 6 months or a year or something like that, the employer is going to have some language written in your employment contract that's going to preclude you from taking that money with you. Normally, you have to be vested. And so vesting, one of the companies I work for, I think it was after 3 years, you would be able to take 50% of the amount that they contributed. You can always take the amount you contributed. That's your money. But in terms of getting the amount they contributed, you had to stay for 3 years to get 50%, and after 5 years, you got the whole 100%. That company was actually pretty good, but they did something very stupid. They had a thing with no match. They just said, we are going to give you 10% of your income, and we're going to put it in a 401k for you. You don't have to contribute anything. It's like, wow, that's cool. Well, then they ratcheted that back, and they said, okay, yeah, we're gonna put in 6%, and if you put in 4%, and yeah, this is a better deal for you. It's like, that was just blatantly false. They reduced their contribution by 4%, and you had to make it up. But their argument was they were a publicly traded corporation and made them a stronger company, and you should be proud. But whatever, it was nonsensical. So one of the reasons I no longer work there. Defined contribution. So this is the 401k where you're contributing. So defined contribution. You won't have to. We won't split these out in the test, but defined benefit and defined contribution, 2 different types. Any type of retirement, yeah, you need to save as soon as possible for your retirement because of the time value of money. Contribute from every paycheck, yep, and it's easy just to come up with a percentage, and that way it's not a huge impact. You're like, well, I'm not making much money right now. Well, then keep it at 10% or something, and 10% of not very much money is not very much money. But when you start making more money, 10 to 15% of that paycheck becomes bigger. So it kind of works. But the big thing is, if they're doing a match, you got to do it. You got to figure out a way to get that friggin' match. Because if you're working, for a company and you're making $100,000 a year, and they've got, a 3% match, well, you're working for $103,000. And if you don't contribute your $2,000, you're taking a pay cut. You're working for less than your coworker, who's doing exactly the same job as you because you're not disciplined enough to put away just a small percentage. Now, whether you choose to go above the match, that's on you. But if you're not getting the match, you're not bright. You're not thinking. So, money contributed is like extra income. Offers tax deferred income, yeah. This is kind of a problem. Sometimes they tie your hands a little bit. They'll want to try and steer you into certain funds. Maybe they'll give you some liberty or a selection of funds or a couple different companies to work with. I always strove and I sought out the self-directed portion, but they wouldn't let me do 100%, as I talked about in a previous lecture. But anyway, this is where you kind of got to know what you're doing. The other thing about a lot of these plans is, don't necessarily blow off this financial stuff, because when you walk in there the first day or first week when you're doing your employee orientation that most companies have, or maybe it's online or maybe it's in attendance, whatever, but they're going to expect you to make a bunch of decisions that a lot of times they're not reversible. They call it a cafeteria type plan, where you choose the health care you want, you choose the investment program you want, and you're a brand new employee, so you're less likely to ask a bunch of questions, especially stupid ones. So you want to kind of already have some familiarization with this before you walk in your new job, so you make good choices, and you try to impress your employer, since you're still making your first impression. Anyway, this is how it's supposed to work. Like I say, I think it's pretty flat, if not increasing. I've got whatever, as you become kind of squared away, you're like, yeah, I've got disposable money. I mean, whatever. And it depends how you run your life. When you can live within your means and decide what's good. I mean, again, I'm kind of fortunate. Give me a PBR and a 4Runner and I'm fine. And if you've got that kind of attitude, then yeah, I'll be more aggressive in the hopes of getting. But I've got some stability. I'm not that reckless, but if I wouldn't want to live on Social Security, that's for sure. But I think I can do a little bit better than that. And there's so much, you're leaving money on the table right now with the market kind of booming as it is. You got to take advantage of it. You got to get off the porch. But that's just me. Okay, so yeah, these numbers are, like I said, about 20 grand. These numbers are getting dated. I need to update this. They also have this catch-up thing, but again, if you just put a small amount of money away when you're first starting out, and that's the insidious thing about student loans and other things, that man, they're taking that money from you in those young years, when if you were investing that money would really be doing big things for you over time. Talked about matching contributions. Yep, 59.5 problem. They do have some things, but there's ways around this. You'll hear people talk about stock options. I mean, obviously Elon Musk, we talk about wealth inequality. Elon Musk, I guess, is a trillionaire now. So there you go. I'm not saying there's not systemic problems out there. This wealth, whatever, but if you think either political party is at all interested in solving that, you have two groups of people, and they could span either party, but you have some people who have power, some people who have money, some people have both, whatever. The people, by the time they get to the top, they have wealth and power, and it's like Wile E. Coyote, where they act like they're adversaries, and they click the little time clock and go hang out in the restaurant and play golf and live in the same neighborhoods. There's a lot of theater, but anyway, the problems we're seeing right now, this wealth inequality thing, that's not leading to a content society. So, which is all the more reason to have a little bit of money set aside in case the things go downhill. Matching contributions by employers. We've kind of gone through that. Yeah, if you take money out, you can do that, but you'll pay a 10% penalty if it's not for some sort of hardship. But if you absolutely have to take it out, I did this one time. I was, I had a daughter in a private school, and I needed the money to keep her in there, and, it was mid-divorce, and you got to do what you got to do. I'm not going to screw the kid over, so I sucked it up and paid a little bit of a penalty. But not a great thing, but it wasn't huge amounts of money. But yeah, they hit you, and then they hit you again. They charge you the 10% penalty, and then they also get that tax deferred thing. Well, that's income's added back in your income, and you're taxed on that. So now there is another program. So all these other things we've talked about, all these tax deferred type things, 401ks, 403bs, all that stuff, IRAs, individual retirement accounts. There is another one, the Roth, sometimes, Roth IRA, but anyway, the key word is Roth. That's just some random politician who wrote the law. But anything under the Roth plan, let's say you're making $100,000 and you contribute $5,000 to the Roth IRA or 401k. If you do that, you're still taxed for your whole $100,000 worth of income. It's not tax deferred in that way. But when you go to pull that money out, and if you invest it early, and say this money went from $5,000 up to $100,000 in that one little account, any money you pull out of that account is not taxed. Again, it's already been taxed when you contributed it. It's not after tax money. I mean, it is after tax money. You paid the taxes on that $5,000 of income, then you deposited it, and so all of the earnings, all the winnings from that account are not taxed, which is pretty cool. Now, all these things are kind of, it gets kind of philosophical. Some people think, well, it's the government's money, and you're doled out a little bit. And other people are like, no, it's our money, and the government, we give them money. Well, anyway, from a political sense, if the economy gets desperate, there are a number of politicians who would love to get rid of 401ks and Roth IRAs and, change that, because it can be pretty beneficial to you. But with the 401k specifically, not the Roth, the 401k, it is kind of a gamble in the fact that you're not paying taxes on it now, which is a known quantity. You're going to pay taxes on it in retirement, which is an unknown quantity. You don't know what the tax rate is going to be, when you're, retired, or where you're going to be. I mean, obviously, I don't think you're going to go to California and New York for retirement. Probably not smart. If you went to California, for example, and you pull out that money and you've got a considerable amount of money, you're going to lose 63% of it to income tax. Ugh, that's a little brutal. So, 403p, that's for nonprofits, which include education, teachers and stuff. So what they're getting to, you don't have to memorize all these different names of all these programs, but just keep in mind that there's a method for some 401k like tax deferred account available in most employment situations. You can even have them for self-employed. So 100 employees or fewer. Then there's other things companies can do. Profit sharing. You see some of the local businesses, who have something like that, where they have employee stock ownership or employee ownership. Employee stock ownership plan. Contribute sums Yeah, the problem with this, again, the same company that used to have pretty good benefits, the big company I was working for, one of the defense contractors, and they had a method at which I could buy company stock directly from the company, so original issue stock, not stuff on the secondary market. I could buy stock in their company for a 5% discount. Now, I wasn't a big fan of this company I was working for, so I would get the stock, thank you very much, and sell it the next day and pocket the 5%. They only allowed me to do, I don't know, 10,000 a year like that, but hey, 5% of $10,000 is good money, reasonable money. Anyway, and the other thing is, if you're already working for a company, your employment's based upon them, and now the company goes bankrupt or something, you've lost your retirement, you lost it all. Not good. When you're leaving an employer or transferring from an employer, this key word here is rollover. Unless you're 59 and a half, you almost always want to roll it over. You never want to say, hey, I've got some 401k money, I want a check. If they cut you a check and it's got your name on it only, or it's transferred into your account, you're screwed. You just did a huge taxable event that's going to result in a 10% penalty plus all the taxes on it. And you probably didn't want to do that. What you can do is you can either leave with the company or you can go to your new company, and they probably have a 401k program as well, and you just say, I want to roll over the money from this account to that account. And so then you may again get a check in the mail, but this time it's going to have your name on it, but it's going to be, say, for the benefit of you. And it's not going to be, you can't run into a bank and cash it. It's got to be delivered to the other investment company and kept in that 401 tax deferred status. If you take a distribution, you have screwed the pooch. You just created a problem. Now, financial people are, pretty smart, and they're gonna, but if you go in there with attitude and, they're like, oh, okay, the big get even, and they say, well, that's what you asked for. Here you go. Because you could be leaving under bad terms. Don't let them do that. Keogh, another way to do it. So, self-employed. SEPs. Same type of scheme. We can go more in depth in this, but I'm not going to address every one, or it's too much information. You get lost in the weeds. What you're looking, the big category is tax deferred retirement accounts, and then the only unique thing you need to keep track of is the Roth. That the Roth is a little bit different, and that is after tax money, but the withdrawals are not taxed. So Roths are pretty cool. Traditional IRA or just IRA. But yeah. So same. Yeah, if you're making too much money, you can actually get excluded from your ability. Your dollar figures on that, they're going to be individualized. So you have to look up, and they change from year to year. Comparison of the two. Yeah. So if you're using the Roth, you are paying taxes right now before you put the money in there. But the huge advantage on the Roth is all that money accumulating. If you've done well, if you do well under, say, a 401k and you invest $5,000 and it turns in $100,000, you're responsible for paying taxes on $100,000 worth of income. If you have the Roth and you have $5,000 you had to pay taxes on now, but when it swells to $100,000, you don't have to pay taxes on that 100,000. So huge. Marginal tax rates. So not everybody, retiring and just doing nothing is not necessarily a recipe for a healthy life. I mean, a lot of people retire, they stop, and it's not it doesn't necessarily work out. Most people stay active, or they are fortunate enough to be in a career that they actually like and they want to continue to work. They don't mind it, or they, scale back perhaps. So the notion that your income is going to be greatly, reduced may not be the case. Annuities, they're just kind of thrown in here. Annuities typically are not a good deal. It's a cool concept. It's kind of like a life insurance policy, but in reverse. The problem with life insurance policy is in order to collect, you got to die. With an annuity, the longer you live, the more money you get. But the biggest problem with annuity is that they're sold, they're typically complex products, which means they're sold to you by a salesman. They're typically offered by insurance companies. And so because of that, insurance companies aren't the best at investing. They usually, because of the nature of their business, they have to be quite conservative. And because it's a complex product, there's a salesman, kind of like my brother-in-law, who explained this all to you. And every year when your annuity renews, he gets another commission, So there's a lot of friction that ends up. The concept's great if they come up with a simplified annuity that's more aggressively invested. Wouldn't be bad, but concept with an annuity is, say you give these guys $10,000 and they start giving you payments of $100 a month forever, meaning the rest of your natural life. If you die next week, not a great deal. If you keep living, then you're making money. Now those numbers I'm using are kind of notional, but anyway, you can see that the payments continue as long as you live. Variable annuity, yeah. So again, because we start getting the life insurance kind of talk where they do universal and variable, just means that they're trying to invest in other types of securities rather than some of the traditional investment vehicles that they've used that are fairly unimpressive results. High fees, so that's all that commission and everything else going on. And then if you, try to pull out the original money, there's a problem penalty. Commissions to salespeople, so again, that's where that goes. Yeah. So a lot of this stuff, mutual funds are all no loads now, and so there could be a point where you get more aggressive. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the concept of annuities, great, but in actuality, in performance, they don't work out quite as good. So all these things that they're showing you here are much better illustrated by the charts that we showed at the first few days. Those Excel spreadsheets showing that, putting in $500 a month and you end up with $5.1 million. They're going to be far more dramatic than these charts. So there's still going to be a few here, but it's all the time value of money. How these small amounts, and 6%, you can get more than 6% without risking, if you've got 40 years to do it, you need to get more than 6%. You can handle a few market fluctuations as long as it keeps going up. So you get the percentages up there. I'm not saying maybe double digits might be a little much, but 10 is, entry level double digits, and that's certainly attainable. Tax benefit for a retirement account, yeah. So you're probably not going to take huge moves. I had invested in property. I had because I was being kind of forced on some of the investment choices I could do with my 401k, I was able to transfer part of it to it's kind of a goofy concept, but they could hold real estate under my 401k, which was kind of cool. So I was able to buy a rather large chunk of property that I didn't have the cash for, and I didn't want to take a loan for it, but I had a ton of money in my retirement account. And so my property used to say, for the benefit of, and had my name attached to it. And according to the IRS, I couldn't derive any personal benefit from whatever. I couldn't put a house on it. I could run a business, but I'd have to be very particular about separate accounting. But, the back 1/3 of my property and then another big property up by Chickaloon were both owned under my 401k. And it was kind of cool. So anyway, I like to, as much as I like the stock market, I'm not, whatever. I like to diversify. And with real estate, especially on raw land, banks aren't interested in making loans on raw land. At least, well, they generally don't. And if they do, the rates are excessive to where you could make any investment kind of a non-starter. Chapter 20, estate planning. So retirement planning, you were alive. Estate planning, you're gone. You've checked out. So you can, do things. You can do your heirs a favor and have everything organized, or you can just die what they call intestate with no will. And if you die intestate, in actuality, the state may end up with your property. And the lawyer's going to get a lot of it. I just went to a place out here, and oh my God, this guy they get like this old man disease where they just start collecting stuff, garbage. And he had like little tunnels. He was a hoarder, but on an acre scale, and just acres of garbage on just useless equipment. Anyway, thank God he didn't have any heirs or anything, so it went to the state and was sold in an estate sale. But what a friggin' mess. If he would have had heirs, if he would have had children, they would have been livid if they had to weed through all this stuff that this guy left behind. So anyway, estate planning. This is how your wealth is going to be distributed, after you're dead. And then there's a thing called a will that I think most of us are familiar with. And that is the opposite of dying intestate. Intestate means dying without a will. Dying with a will is the way it should be done. And that's just a legal document. So it's signed, generally prepared by a lawyer, perhaps a paralegal, but it certainly is witnessed, and it's done in accordance with the state that you're living in. It's probate courts. That's where wills and all the estates are settled. That is a state function. So if you moved, from here to Montana, you no longer have a will. You need a new will for Montana. Now, the other thing about wills is you also don't want to make them too specific. You don't want to say, well, I want this and that and this property located here. If you do that, you can, but it's going to mean that will is going to have to be renewed every time one of those properties is sold or something's changed. It's far easier to have a more general will, just to say all my assets or whatever the legal speak is are divided equally amongst my children. That will suffice. That will do great things. That can be acted upon by the court. If you don't have that, there's going to be some confusion, and it's just going to take time and money, and you've basically shown that you don't really care how your estate's done. So it wasn't your priority to make sure everything worked out, that your family got everything squared away. So the court is not going to be in a huge hurry to, help you out, because you could have done this yourself. You could have not left everybody in a bad situation just by having a simple will. Reasons for having a will. Yep. They will get the money quicker. They'll get you, get whatever expenses taken care of. Intestate, dying without a will. And if you're in that situation, you know, you, once again, the lawyers in law school, they're not like, oh, I want to go into estate law, because that's I guess it's the guys who can't make it in family court will probably end up in estate law. I doubt it's the most exciting field of practice. So these guys are probably not, the strongest swimmers, and things are probably gonna get jacked up. Creating a will. Yep. You got to be legal age in the state. Mentally competent. Not under duress. That's where the witnesses come in. Signed and dated. Who aren't the beneficiaries. Use of attorney recommended. Yeah, if you wanted to comply with you're wasting your time if you don't have at least a paralegal or somebody. Paralegals are like lawyers, but they're whatever, a half or a third of the cost. Common types of wills. There's only really one will that, this gets kind of confusing when they start talking about subsets of wills. You don't care about these categories. You want a will that's going to specify how your assets are distributed. Because people start getting this thing of, oh, it's a living will or it's a holographic will. Those aren't wills. Those are other documents that may be nice to have, but they're not going to get your assets distributed correctly. So, executor, that's the representative. Typically, they may be the one to get the lawyer who's going to take care of this for you. All your stuff's going to go into a trust. The trust is going to, sell vehicles and pay bills and then figure out what's left. And you could, if you got a lot of stuff, you could have a trust that lives on after you. But most cases, people have a trust to get everything settled. Then the trust, all the assets are distributed to the heirs per the will, and then the trust goes away. Guardian, yeah. But again, that's getting maybe beyond a will and certainly beyond personal finance. How that's going to be done, that's other decisions. Obviously, the signature and the witnesses. Funeral arrangements, again, we're getting out of personal finance when we start talking about guardians and pulling the plug and all that other stuff. Changing your will. So if you wrote a good general will, you hopefully don't have to do this all the time. But if you move to a different state, yeah, you got to do it. You can also, do these codicils or addendums or a right or some sort of, it's essentially a contract and you're changing a legal document. Or, in the real world, you just print out a new copy with the changes and you have a clean will without extraneous documents. Executing the will. So probate, state court that does it, executor takes care of it, should just go smoothly. The heirs will get their money, everything will be settled. They'll be, celebrating you at your funeral and not cursing you because you left a big pile of financial and other garbage behind for them. Sample will. Yep. Anyway, this kind of predates the internet even. You'll figure out who's going to do the will for you. They'll give you some sort of form, with fill in the blanks. They represent you with this will. You go into their office. They get a couple random people, people walking around the office. Hey, witness this will. And you walk out the door with the legal will. And then you put it somewhere and tell the heirs where you've put it. Most of the stuff is spelled out legally, if there's something omitted, but yeah, if there's clear, but if you don't want it to go, to whatever, more legal issues. I'm not a lawyer, but you could specify details in there. Estate taxes generally aren't a factor unless your estate's getting up into the millions. Yeah, so quite high. Again, these numbers are old, but there hasn't been a big push to increase them. But yeah, they get pretty confiscatory when they get high, when it gets to high dollar amounts. But people with this kind of money, they got lawyers. Their stuff is in a trust. You know, the smart thing to do is if you have, assets like that you get them transferred to your children or whoever before you pass, so that it's not this huge transition. And it also, we'll talk more about this, like if you've got a business that's a sole proprietorship or a big farm that's just in your name, your kids are probably going to lose that. It's going to come down as income, all in one lump sum, and they won't be able to pay the taxes, and it's gone. So, if you are fortunate enough at some point in your life to end up as a high wealth individual, you need to get your estate squared away before you even, get sick. Obviously, the usual suspects. Alaska is usually pretty favorable on this. Yep, plan appropriately. So, obviously, that's a nice problem to have. Trust, gifts, contributions. So, the trust, we talked about that, where you can set that up. You can also be in situations where, let's say you've got a bunch of property and you're like, I've got a neighbor who's, well, it's already happened. His kids kind of took it, but he knows that this land, these kids, they have no appreciation for the land that he has, and they just want to sell it to developers or do something with it. And anyway, he could have perhaps set that up in a trust and even gifted it to one of the trust companies, although they're kind of scammy. But anyway. So some of these trusts, though, where there are situations where right now, because some of the land I have could be deemed agricultural land, I could, if I could make my property taxes, I could, go to one of these folks, Farmlands Forever or whoever, and do the paperwork and get the property, get restrictive covenants put on the property to say it needs to remain agricultural land, and basically have my property taxes forgiven for the rest of my life. But it will restrict what my heirs could do with the property and things like that. So if you're willing to give up your development rights in some sort of irrevocable trust, they're not interested in giving you a revocable trust for something like that. You can't say, oh, I want a do-over. I'm going to revoke that trust. No, it'd be an irrevocable trust, and give your property to Great Land Trust or Farmlands or whatever. That would be something people could do. But again, nice problems to have for certain people. Gifts. Yep, you can give a certain amount to your kids per year. Whoops. You could give it all the way to charity. That could be part of your will. Or you could, do it while you're still alive. Get invited to a few banquets or something if that's what you're trying to do. Yeah, that's, again, beyond personal finance. Power of attorney. They just kind of throw this in here. Power of attorney is huge. Power of attorney, never, ever. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, but don't sign a power of attorney, a general power of attorney. General is the problem. If let's say you want someone to sell your car, and because you're leaving the state or something, and you give them a general power of attorney, and you come back and you find out, yeah, they sold your car, and they also sold your house, and they took your investments, and they did that. I mean, because you gave them a general power of attorney, you gave them the ability to act as you on legal matters. So if you're going to leave or do anything with a power of attorney, it should always say limited power of attorney and specify what that power of attorney is for, and not for everything. It's just for that particular item, that particular bit of business. Durable power of attorney for healthcare. Okay, again, getting into other issues. This is a big deal, though. Where do you keep that will? Let the heirs know, where that's going to be. Could be in a safe deposit box. Could be in just a fireproof safe. Could be in a copy just given to them up front. So, estate planning information. Well, the will, that's kind of nice. Life insurance policies. If you did things right, you probably don't have any of these left. Retirement account information. Yeah, I mean, you can find that out. Home ownership, that's all public documents. Ownership of other real estate. I mean, this is kind of nice to have, but that will is huge. Ownership of businesses, that's recorded by the state already. Personal legal documents, certainly. But that will is the key thing. What that doesn't exist. The lawyer generally doesn't keep a copy. No, I've never. Recent tax returns, I could find those in 2 minutes online. The IRS keeps them for you, and they're the ones that count. They're not so interested in account information for bank accounts. Again, you can get a lot of these details back. They're nice to have, but not quite as important. What would be nice to have with your will and your other stuff is maybe pictures or a CD or video of all your possessions and stuff in case there's a fire. Not to say that you're going to die in this fire, but your personal finance documents should have your will. They should have stuff that should help you out in case there's some sort of accident or something where the house is destroyed and you need to establish a claim. If you just go to the insurance company and say, yeah, I had a bunch of stuff, let me think about it, it's far easier just to have pictures, jog your memory, it shows the condition, it's just a better setup. And that's it. Wow, seems like that, what kind of long? Oh boy, I hope this record. Yeah, about just an hour. All right then. That's it for retirement planning, estate planning. We're just kind of dabbled in those two, but again, the thing about saving, saving and investing, is that a lot of times those big investments will end up in your retirement accounts, but you can get access to them, and you should. It's not like there is that 59.5, but there's a lot of things you can do before that, especially if you need it for some sort of hardship, or especially if you just want it for a loan, or like I say, I bought property with it. I couldn't buy my own house with it, but I subdivided my big property and put 40 acres or so in it, and so that worked. And then just take it back over, retitle it once you hit 59.5. Easy. Anyway, that's it for tonight.